Good morning, everybody. Oh wow, look at that. Audience participation. Everybody's very keen to be here. It's my very great pleasure to welcome you to the Plymouth Marine Laboratory for the Southwest Marine Ecosystems meeting. My name is Tim Smythe. I am the Director of Science here at PML. Just a bit of history about PML. We've been here 50 years. As of 1977, we became a company limited by guarantee and a charity 25 years ago. So we kind of came out of government control then. We've currently got about 160 staff here, of which about 90 are scientists. PML also hosts some of the longest marine ecosystem time series in the world. So some of them can trace their provenance back to the late 19th century. Those were started by the Marine Biological Association, and we've, as joint organisations, continued many of those forward into the present day. So it's really a very fitting place to hold this conference. So thank you, Bob, for this opportunity, but it's here for you to use today. Just a few housekeeping, inevitably, announcements. We are not expecting any fire alarms. As you may have noticed, those of you who are regular here, we haven't been able to use these side doors. So the fire exit is just behind the screen there. The door is not alarmed, so we can get out that way. We're also going to be opening that door during the breaks, so we actually allow some oxygen into the room and we don't fall to sleep. The facilities, toilet facilities, are back out through this door and continue straight down, and there's facilities there. I respectfully ask that people don't bring food and drink into here. Water's fine. It's just so that we can... People are putting their drinks down. Excellent. I didn't notice. It's just so that we can preserve the fabric of the room for as long as possible. So, Bob, over to you.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much, Tim. It's fantastic that we're able to use this facility at PML. I can't think, it's extremely appropriate because, as Tim has pointed out, there are lots of connections to the work going on here, and we are going to be looking at marine ecosystems, and that's one of the kind of key parts of what the work that's done. So, I'm going to welcome you to what will be a rather remarkable day. In my terms, it's unique because, as you'll know, I've organised lots of conferences in my time. I've never organised anything quite like this ever before, nor actually experienced it ever before. So it is going to be different, and you'll need to kind of open your minds, okay? And I'll start to explain why it's going to be different in a second. Southwest Marine Ecosystems has got the word ecosystems in it, yeah? But the reality, of course, is that, and we know, well, I mean, if this was an exam setting, for example, and I'd given you all an hour to write an essay on, marine ecosystems, how they work, you'd all pass. All of you would pass. You'd talk about food webs and food chains and energy flows and interactions and relationships between the environment and you'd all pass. And then you can hear the but coming, can't you? In the sense, but, of course, we work in silos. And if you're in your silo, then by and large, you don't have to worry about other people's silos. And in a certain sense, SWME, like everyone else, traditionally has essentially a program of about 12 thematic silos, which we cover each year. This year is going to be completely different. We're going to jump out of those silos. Now, people tell me, eminent scientists tell me that ecosystems are discussed in many different settings, often in places like OSPAR or ICES, or in exotic European cities like Reykjavik and Copenhagen, Roger. But, of course, if you happen to be working in Plymouth, in essence, you want to talk about the ecosystems in the southwest and in the kind of Plymouth area. So we'll make no apologies for kind of the focus, if you will, of the discussion today on ecosystems in the kind of southwest. But bringing this program together has provided challenges. And the best way of describing it is an experiment. Okay? SWMI, you'll hear me talk about Southwest Marine Ecosystems as SWMI a lot. SWMI has the freedom to experiment. You know, we don't have to meet anyone's requirements for funding this or funding that. We can do the experiment. And this meeting is an experiment. Okay? So, you know, bear that in mind, and we're looking forward to your inputs on this to help us with this. And I just want to sort of let me put something quite clearly to you now. On Sunday, I'm going to the Wigmore Hall to listen to my daughter play in a Baroque concert. It's the first concert her ensemble has played in the Wigmore Hall, and it is the pinnacle of places to play. My daughter and her colleagues rehearse and practice so that their music is meticulously precise. Today isn't going to be like that. It is absolutely the alternative of Baroque music. Okay? So please forgive us if there are warts and all sorts of other things happening that actually make this slightly more dynamic. You're going to hear about 30 odd plus topics. Each one of those topics could be an hour's presentation or a day's conference. And you're going to hear about them all in one day. So you're going to have to step back in terms of your thinking and the way you think about today and just kind of let it weigh over you. But in a certain sense, your impressions of the day are really important, and we'll be seeking your views on that. We want to kind of get your sense of the changes that are taking place in the southwest, and we want to try and make sense of those. We want to try and make sense of them because when, in the SWMI process, we do the press and media work at the end of our cycle, the press always ask, why were there octopus? Why were there bluefin tuna? Why? We're doing this conference in one sense to give a sense of why some of these things are happening. Can we make sense of the past in order to help us inform the future? I mean, in one sense, if we can't make sense of the past in a setting of Plymouth, where there are so many marine scientists, if we can't make sense of the past, there is something slightly wrong. Okay? So, you'll hear quite a lot about the past and the present and the future. Having said that, we also need to, in a sense, make sense of that in relation to what we do moving forward. In SWMI land, are we actually recording the right things each year, or do we need to look at different things? What lessons do we need to take? So that's the sort of the backdrop to the conference. If we come to the session on the past, which I'll introduce now, you'll have all received a slide pack of about 60 odd slides. That will be on the Southwest Marine Ecosystems website for another month, and then it will be taken down. So if any of you want those slides or want to see what's on them, take them down or copy them onto your slides at the moment. We've asked essentially something like 23 different people to contribute individual slides. There are often individual slides covering particular topics, and you can see the people here have been the contributors. And I have to thank also the narrators who will, Libby and Abigail and Keith, and I'll be doing a bit of narrating too, but essentially for taking you through this process. I've covered that. The process for this particular session is this, that you'll get all of this slide pack in one fell swoop, okay? And then we'll have a short break to kind of gain some oxygen, and then we're going to the discussion. But we want to hear your points in that discussion. If you want to sort of take a pause through the presentation, the thing to say is there are 6 main themes, okay, that have emerged in this slide pack. And when we get to those theme breaks, the kind of the narrators will change. So Abigail and Libby are going to do the first one, Libby and Keith will do the second, and so on and so forth. We're going to be talking about change, and I don't want to get into semantics of change, but some of the changes we're going to be describing are random. We don't know what's caused them. Diseases are a bit like that. Some changes are gradual, some changes are huge. Whether you call them abrupt community shifts or regime shifts or whatever, is another matter. Some changes are collapses and some changes are explosions. But essentially, we're going to be talking about the language of change. And with no further ado, I shall invite Abigail up to do the first few slides.
Thanks, Bob. Okay. I need to put these down because I'm short. Okay. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you guys. If I haven't met you, I'm Abigail, and I'm a professor of marine conservation at University of Plymouth, and I'll talk through theme 1. Did we decide if this works? Oh, it does work. Okay. So we're starting with the environment with marine heat waves. These slides are from Tim here at PML. I know there's a lot to look at, but we'll just talk about a few key points. So when we think about marine heat wave, it's when the temperature exceeds the 90th percentile, so an extreme burst of heat. And in the Southwest, we've had 3 in kind of our recent memory in 2023, 2024, and 2025, which you can see on the left graph when we look at the temperature anomalies at the surface and then at depth. And these heat waves are caused by long periods of strong sunshine and reduced wind speed, so summer basically, and then the absence of cold weather, so like a more mild winter. So in addition to marine heat waves, we also have extreme climate events like storms. On the top, we can see wave height, a time series of wave heights. The red is the storm threshold, so anything over that is considered a storm. Storms are normal, and they're a frequent part of just like living in the Southwest, as we all know. But our extreme storms have caused high impacts. So these are storms that usually come from the east. The most impacts are caused when they happen in close succession. So at one point we had 3 named storms in only 7 days. Or these are combined with other meteorological drivers like low temperature, so the beast from the east, or Storm Emma in 2018, or even just when we have high tides at the same time that we have the storms. And these storms cause ecological impacts. So obviously on the intertidal and subtidal species, they can cause shallow subtidal washouts of benthic species, mass mortalities of juvenile gray seals. So they found over 1,000 seals were killed in a short storm event recently. And then, of course, we know what happens to coastal infrastructure. So if you live down here, you probably remember 2014 when the train was out at Dawlish and we had to take the rail replacement bus, and it was so painful. And then it was similar. The Slapton Sands Road that goes right by the sea washed out from storms in 2014 and 2026. So when we think about these kind of extreme events, we're also thinking about our long-term climate cycles. So kind of one of our first understandings of these climate cycles was the Russell cycle. And it was developed by lots of people, including Alan Southward, who's part of Plymouth at the MBA. And it was based on plankton studies in the Southwest. And when Russell proposed this, it was really groundbreaking in terms of oceanology. So to even know we have these big cyclical changes or patterns in our environment was, that was the first time this was pointed out. And the Russell cycle was the prevailing paradigm really for the main part of the 20th century. And one of the key features is the changes between calanus, which is a copepod, and invertebrate larvae and pilchard eggs, which dominated plankton hulls. So you can see in this image in different parts of the Russell cycle, we get different amounts of plankton in our plankton hulls. So what does this mean more specifically? So reading into this, turns out, do we know if the Russell cycle is still relevant? So I tried to kind of summarize the AMO versus the Russell cycle. So the Atlantic Multidecadal Oscillation, or AMO, is kind of links to the warmer phase of the Russell cycle. And in the AMO's high phase, or the Russell cycle's warm phase, we usually see warmer water temperature. So the things that go with it are more stratification, weaker nutrient mixing, lower plankton biomass, warm water species. We're more likely to have warm water fish like sardines, anchovies, red mullet, sea bream, and biodiversity, so we get, our warmer water species go northwards while the boreal species retreat. And it's good for warm water fisheries like sardines, but not good for something like herring. And then in the low AMO phase, or the cool regime of the Russell cycle, we see the opposite with that. Cooler temperatures, dominance of the plankton by cold water species like Sagitta elegans. It's better for herring and cod and the things that we like to eat, which are mostly cold water species in the UK. And then those boreal species return, and the warmer water species get pushed back to the equator. But in 2016, Priscilla Lacandro found that we do have some indications about these cycles in the zooplankton, but there's no longer any strong evidence that the Russell cycle is still running as it has historically on its climate-linked schedule. And she found that ecosystem changes are more likely to be irregular regime shifts rather than a response to the true climate cycles that we see. And one of the reasons for this, of course, could be what we are doing to the planet. So human-driven warming could be disrupting these natural cycles. But, this is a 2016 paper. Now we've had nearly 10 more years of data, so this needs to be kind of examined in a more current context. So I mentioned the AMO. So we know the AMO is one of our major climate oscillations, but we also have the NAO, the North Atlantic Oscillation, which we measure by this winter index. And it's been in positive phases more frequently lately. And in Priscilla Lacandro's 2016 paper, she took a look at how the AMO and the NAO are reflected in winter temperature at E1 out of Plymouth, and they both appear linked to our winter temperatures. But where it gets more interesting from a plankton person's point of view is where these big changes in our climate cycling are reflected in the plankton. So this was a paper that Martin Edwards did. This couldn't be right because that says 2013 in 2013, where they looked at the kind of principal components of sea surface temperature and plotted those out, and then superimposed CPR data and the Norwegian herring stock data on top of that to find out where things aligned. And when we look at this, we can see that the principal components of SST link well to the second principal component of phytoplankton and zooplankton. The important thing is the plankton are doing what the temperature is doing, and then we think the temperature is linked to these big climatic cycles like the AMO and the NMO, or the AMO and the NAO. So in addition to our big climatic cycles and then sporadic things like storms and extreme weather events, we also have El Nino, which is another one of our climatic cycles. And Gregory Beaugrand, who some of you might know from the CPR survey, he actually was looking at these stepwise changes or abrupt community shifts in relation to El Nino events, and found that when we have weak or strong episodes of El Nino, we are more likely to have an abrupt community shift. But this doesn't happen all the time, and the spatial extent of these two things can differ. But what he did find was that he actually predicted in the late 2010s, so around 2019, an abrupt community shift that we'll find out later did materialize on his prediction. So this slide is another plankton slide from Angus. Thank you, Angus. And there's kind of two key things to look at here of changes in the plankton. So on the left, we've seen a decrease in summer phytoplankton in the L4 time series. And this is a sign of long-term warming because these are regular so this is chlorophyll, so phytoplankton biomass, and it's linked to long-term warming. We've seen an increase in summer nitrate limitation, and the kind of key message is that the summer phytoplankton biomass has halved in the past 20 years. But what we've seen also is that we've seen an increase in the plankton community. So we're seeing a dominance of small plankton as opposed to our larger microplankton. And we've seen a dominance of meroplankton and gelatinous filter feeders. So these are changes at the base of the marine food web. And as we look up the food web, it causes us to say, is this the right kind of food web to support fish? And are these happening as part of a longer regime shift? Or is this a steady kind of decline? and how is this affecting top-down control? So these are questions that we're still looking at, we're still answering. Libby, I think you're next. Okay, and I'll pass it to Libby about fish.
Just a couple of little follow-on slides. So silver darlings, herring, once a really abundant and important fishery in many European countries, including England. Easy to forget now. Caught all the way up, we think of Clovelly a lot when we think of herring, but actually all the way up into the Severn Estuary and Minehead had a really dominant fishery there historically. These graphs show that, we know that herring, these short-lived species, are naturally boom-bust, but they're also very vulnerable to fisheries. So there was a huge peak in catches in the 60s, which, interestingly, because the stocks were doing so well, fishing mortality doesn't actually quite look as brutal in that bottom left slide as the more recent peak in 2015 of fishing effort, which looks so high because stocks were already not in a great state, and we'll come on to that later. So herring have is it a natural fluctuation, or is it natural fluctuation combined with fisheries? Well, almost certainly the latter. But they are definitely declining in more recent years. If you look at that bottom right spawning stock biomass, it's below every single precautionary limit and looks like a full stock collapse. What's a real shame is in the 90s there was a previous stock collapse, and there was actually really great management put in place, stakeholder-led, but with ICES, and there was a really big rebuilding programme, and it was successful, and it got above those preliminary, those sort of baselines, and it was doing really well. And then the fishery opened up, and we did exactly the same thing. But there's some pretty good indications that we might not be as lucky with a second rebuilding plan, and I think that will come apparent throughout today. Good news is that other species are maybe coming in to fill herring's place to some extent. So this is from Jeroen van der Kooij's brilliant Peltic survey that is underpinning so much of what we know, like the PML data. So that we know that there's other small pelagics, the warm water species, are doing better. So sardine and anchovy in particular are increasing in abundance. They all seem to be increasing at a similar rate. There's probably some interaction. You usually get a lot of competition between these kind of pelagic species as well, and there's maybe a little bit of probably looking into it a bit too early, but between anchovy and sprat there looks like some differences in timings of the sort of peaks. Interestingly, sprat size has decreased massively, and the population is doing okay, possibly linked to the fact that there's no fishing pressure. They are now basically, the mesh size means that there is no catch in the channel. So we have definitely got a change in the pelagic fish community in the southwest, and I think those earlier slides were pretty convincing in showing that it might be linked to some oceanographic issues. I think the thing to remember with fish, though, it's never that simple. So I'm just going to go back one slide, back to the herring, because I was just reading, because we're narrating, there's really useful information from other people in our narration pack. And herring are known to have really complex metapopulations. So you might have a population in the Celtic Sea, but actually that's made up of lots of little populations that have really complex interactions. And we now know that our Celtic Sea herring quite often swim into the Irish Sea and mix with those populations. And some of them are autumn spawners and some of them are spring spawners. And in some of Abigail's slides we were looking, there are differences in how our plankton are responding in the summer versus the autumn. So we're probably getting shifts in those metapopulations of herring depending on fisheries pressure on those individual subpopulations and when they spawn, because the food chain is changing at different times of year. So, as usual, fisheries more complicated than rocket science. And I think we are moving on to theme 2, which is also me. So again, thank you to all of the contributors who are in the room today, and I will be doing very broad overviews. So if you're in the room and you want to add some detail, please jump in. So the next few slides are absolutely fascinating. So Simon has presented at Southwest Marine Ecosystems lots of times before, and we know now that blue sharks are really increasing. So they have been systematically catch recorded since 1953, which is pretty incredible. Not from science, but from angler records that are really, really detailed and are actually, Simon's shown that they can be really robustly used in detailed analyses. Catch and release is universal now for these species. There were clear and steep declines early 1960s, and then they've recovered. And I think what's really fascinating is they might have now recovered. The catch per unit effort for blue sharks might exceed now the 1950s catch per unit effort. There's influence of ocean currents. They have a pan-Atlantic distribution, possibly southwest fronts. There's data to show that they also respond to fronts. In terms of other species, mako has declined and not returned. So another sort of big change in community. There's been a poor beagle bounce back, which is pretty much the same as the blue shark timeline. And thresher have bounced back since 2015. And I think if I were you, I'd pay particular attention to the dates around 2013 to 2015 as we sort of go through some of these slides. So this is some work done by one of Bryce's students. I don't know if they're in the room, but if they are, thank you very much. It's a beautiful slide. And I think essentially what I take away from this slide, I'm not going to go into the details of the analysis, but basically there are positive correlations with some of the kind of climatic factors that they have looked at. And what's really interesting is that higher sea surface temperatures than the long-term average can affect shark populations a generation later, say 5 to 10 years. So when we start to think about these changes in the southwest, we don't want to just look at kind of those direct correlations. We're going to have to think about the time lags that biology obviously kind of it's pretty obvious when you think of it, but it does add a complication to the analysis. So this is a bit more of a detailed look at those shark numbers, the fact that they've increased. So we've got blue shark on the top left, pretty massive crash. I still find it heartening that things can recover. And like I said before, the catch per unit effort is now higher than the 1950s for blue sharks. Thresher and poor beagle have returned. And this is the really interesting, global shark numbers have not increased. This is not part of a much bigger picture of recovery. This is against the overall picture. So for me, that feels like that is a pretty strong driver, whatever is going on, to actually buck that trend. Similarly, the other good news story that I think we've all been talking about for a few years now, it feels really established. I kind of always wonder whether it would kind of peak and then disappear, but that just doesn't seem to be the case. So yeah, quite rightly, remarkable return of Atlantic bluefin tuna. I still haven't seen one. They came back just as I stopped working on boats pretty much, so I need to work harder at that. They had disappeared primarily from overfishing. There's been lots of science, the Brilliant Fish Intel project, and Tennis UK, and more recently the CHART programme, again, brilliant collaborations with anglers. There is now a fishery, an established fishery, which I think we've talked about with Southwest Marine Ecosystems, was pretty controversial when it started up. I think a lot of people felt, they've just come back, leave them alone. But at the same time, they are one of the most highly managed fisheries, and that establishment does seem to be staying. There are now 15 commercial licences and over 100 recreational fisheries licences, which are all catch and release and monitored very closely. So co-feeding with other species such as shearwaters, which I think we're going to go into now. Yeah, so Alex will laugh because he knows I know nothing about birds. But it's really interesting. Again, we've seen over similar time periods, we've seen really big changes in some species. So Corey's shearwaters have gone from 20 to 700 to 2,500 to 10,000 over the last 10 years. So again, that takes us back to 2014, 2015. And influxes of Wilson storm petrel and great shearwater as well, and an increasing number of rarities. So yeah, pretty interesting picture for those species as well. Do we know what Corys feed on? Sorry to put you on the spot.
They're large seabirds, so decent sized fish.
Okay.
But I don't know specifically.
Okay, so no, that's all right. Thanks, Alex. Some more changes in fish communities. So we'll talk a little about a similar topic in the fishery session in a little bit. But essentially, there have been some really big community changes. We'll talk about actually much further back later on, but community changed in 2015. So a switch from gadoids, so the cods, haddocks, to apex predators. And there's probably linked to a switch in prey species. So we've talked about, herring are a really important prey species for a lot. Herring eggs are also really important for a lot of fish. And when you replace them with something like a sardine, although that's another food item, they're quite often not as oily or not as nutritious. So it's not a like-for-like switch. So herring, sprat, mackerel, changing to sardine and anchovy. So the models suggest that apex predators are changing more in response to those environmental changes, but we already know that those environmental changes are driving a lot of the prey things. So, it is all interlinked. The gadoids are probably responding to fishing pressure. They have been very heavily fished, and also to prey because they are predators. So again, that graph shows that 2015 really big shift in populations. So these are some brilliant look at small fish, so small fish and fish eggs. And I think I'm not even going to try and present this slide because I will not do it justice, but the thing to take away is that the size of fish and I think the diversity has massively declined from some of the sampling at some of our long-term sort of size spectrum survey approaches. So these are kind of really, the really, really small stuff. An eDNA, more recent eDNA survey has found exactly the same thing. I think it's 60% decrease in fish diversity, which, considering we are seeing more warm water species, is pretty worrying, and a smaller size overall. So again, really big ecosystem shifts, and so that it's not just the species that are changing, but it's also, the size, the growth rates, what they're feeding on. The kind of other spectrum, maybe the slightly more coastal species are also changing. We're seeing lots of changes in the sort of warmer water species coming in, entirely predicted by climate change. So we're seeing lots of changes in terms of the bream species we're seeing. So black spot or red bream has come back since 2024. And I think there's been some really recent, like this year and last year, explosion of conger eels, which is really interesting. They're always there. We always have conger eels. They've been part of our fish community for a long time. But there's been absolute explosions. There's a lot more juveniles about at the moment. And because they are pretty voracious predators, they could well become a keystone species. We've talked a little bit about the decline of mackerel and those other things, but these are, again, all interlinked. I think the previous slide, which kind of, I think it showed the size spectrum, but we have got that reduced biodiversity as well. That does worry me because we do have these warm water species moving in, but it seems like not at a similar rate to kind of where we're losing. So basking sharks, there's some really kind of big declines in the southwest. So we saw them here for quite a lot of years. They were pretty well established, and then they declined in sightings number and reports since 2014. 2014 again, strange. But there has been a kind of increase in Irish populations. And I think there's been some really similar kind of thing with humpback whales, but the opposite way around. So this is more kind of recent. This is last year. They disappeared from Irish waters to the point where whale watching businesses are shutting, and they've become more abundant in our seas. Okay. So Calanus decline. What is causing all of these shifts? What is, we know that it's linked to the temperature and the plankton, but this is a really stark graph from Angus. So the L4 site, we've seen the time series before, but there's been a really abrupt shift in the decline in Calanus around 2015. And so, thinking about whether this abrupt shift links to other components. And what are those implications for species that rely on large and nutritious food? Well, I think we've just looked at a whole host of it. It's starting to come together. And I think I'm going to hand over to Keith for spiny lobsters.
Yeah. Strangely, Libby isn't finished yet. I'm just a sort of brief interlude in the middle because these are my slides. So, understanding past ecosystem change and recovery as well. This isn't necessarily a keystone species, it's probably a scavenger, but crawfish are of fantastic interest to divers, to recreational divers, as well as to fishermen. They're a very important catch, particularly in West Cornwall, and the divers took them both commercially and recreationally up until the early 70s, when they disappeared from many places around the whole of the southwest. Not everywhere, but they crashed. And although over-exploitation was assumed to be the reason for the crash, recruitment must have been very poor for many years until 2014. So recruitment, successful recruitment, is going to be very important in recovery. and it was seen in Brittany as well as in southwest England that we started to see small individuals in 2014 where we hadn't observed any since the 1970s. Numbers continue to increase with large number individuals generally in deeper water. And Angus Jackson put this graph together from sea search observations. Sea search, really valuable source of information as to the fantastic increase in spiny lobsters, to the extent where in 2025, Fran Hockley photographed this mass of smallest spiny lobsters on a wreck in Bigbury Bay. They're gathering together, and I'll come back to this when I talk about seashore and seabed. Oops. And then 2025, the year of the octopus. History, trends, causes and consequences. Well, it's been written up. Bryce Stewart has led an excellent consortium project to look at what went on, particularly in relation to fisheries. And that report you can access via the MBA website, where in the sort of news items on the MBA website, you'll see news of the report and you'll be able to access the report, which relates mainly to fisheries. The report, which comes from the questionnaires that sent out to divers, is due to be released very soon once DEFRA have said it can be released. So lots of information which is of natural history interest, but also, of course, very, very important from a fisheries point of view. So Bryce has done the stuff on fisheries. Here's an excellent little article in this issue of British Wildlife magazine about the natural history of the octopus. And you can go to the website for British Wildlife, and for 99p, you can buy a copy of it. But I'm afraid, don't ask me for one. It's copyright issues. So I think, the breeding and the observations about larvae and what they're eating, terrific amount of new information. But yes, I think 2026 is also going to be an important year for octopus. Libby. Oh, you're going to? Right, Angus, right.
Thanks. We've heard quite a lot about time series, and we also heard from Abigail about this idea of abrupt shifts. And Libby mentioned around sort of 2015 and 2016, a lot of things were changing, either going up or down. So I've tried to put all of this information into a single slide. And it's quite a busy slide, so I'll just sort of walk you through it. On the top is a timeline, and I've put together all of the observations I could trace for the last couple of years, both presented at the Southwest Marine Ecosystems and in the annual reports. And I've been a little bit selective about this because I've only chosen time series that are at least 20 years long and have covered 20 years in this century. That's quite important. So I didn't want to sort of cherry pick. So I put these time series together, and basically from top to bottom is sort of going up through the food web. And that's something that the Southwest Marine Ecosystems is really good at. We've got good observations from a load of groups, from the oceanography right up through to the apex predators, seals, whales and cetaceans and sharks. So basically the colours are sort of like trophic levels, physics, oceanography, phytoplankton, zooplankton in the green, going up through to the apex predators in the black. And on these timelines I've put a blob basically where I've seen a sharp change or an inflection or a spike. For example, just halfway down we've got the octopus, and we saw in the last slide the outbreak in 2025, but also back in the 50s, 30s and at the turn of last century. So I just wanted to see if there is any convincing evidence that there was a big shift around sort of 2015. So I've marked in a yellow stripe down in the 2010s, just to give you orientation, and there is generally an aggregation of these blobs or sharp change points in the 2010s. So just as an example of that, a couple of slides, a couple of images on the left examples of both rapid declines in the mid-2010s. So I've given the examples of Calanus and cod, and a few things increased. We heard from Libby about some of the sharks doing very well recently. So on the right, I've just put those blobs into a frequency histogram, and obviously you can't compare a short and a long time series, because if you haven't got data, obviously there's not going to be a change. So I've put it into the really long time series, 60 plus years, and the 20 plus year time series. So you're doing an honest like-for-like comparison. And based on this analysis, there does seem to be an increasing prevalence of shifts in the mid-2010s. We don't know exactly when, but the important point is that it wasn't in the last 4 years, which is actually really interesting. It seemed to be a period of really abrupt shifts. So it's something we want to take forward. This is simply me putting a ruler through time series, doing it sort of like the best I could. There's a lot of fancy statistical analyses that we can do, and we want to bring this forward with things like breakpoint analyses and other statistical time series approaches, and also multivariate. So that's it. I don't know who's next. Right, thanks.
Natural diseases, it says on my programme here, and these events are caused by things like bacteria, by protozoans, by viruses, and in many ways they seem to be random. In other words, they're difficult to predict. Some of them are sporadic. Some might say stochastic if you want to get technical, but they're sporadic. We know they're going to happen sometime, but we don't know when. So you've got a picture here of a very dead-looking gannet during the events of basically bird flu, as it was called. And here's a slide by, oh, I've gone back the wrong way. Yeah, there we are. So in terms of, for instance, Martin, if you actually read the text that's associated with the slide, you'll see that it's very, very interesting, the amount of work which has been done by Plymouth University and Jess Cramp, looking at a 3 metre long core taken at Drake's Island, off Drake's Island in the seagrass bed there, and seeing just how long ago you can still find seeds from seagrass. And the estimate is that the core is 900 to 1300 years old, and seagrass seed found at 120 centimetres, at least 350 to 500 years old. So a very, very long time series, knowing that there was a seagrass bed there off Drake's Island. So that really helps us to understand persistence, but also, if anything horrible happens, a high degree of change. Oh, I keep doing this. Okay, this is my slide, so I should be able to talk to this properly. We've got examples of 5 different disease events. One of them I've already mentioned, but for instance, the pink sea fan one, often it's just the charismatic or commercial species which actually get noticed when a disease event occurs. And I think, you know, that's unfortunate in a way, but that's the way things go. And with pink sea fans, that was the early 1970s. And again, Sea Search documented the degree of infection around southwest England very well. Thank you to Sea Search, a voluntary project. And this is a picture taken at Lundy, top left there, where the sea fan is looking very, very sad indeed. And it went on for about 2 or 3 years, perhaps 4 years. And then we haven't seen, as far as I know, any sign of it since. But it knocked back the pink sea fans at Lundy, and I think there are still some black skeletons still attached to the seabed at Lundy from that early 2000s event. We mentioned seagrass. And the wasting disease in seagrass is something which was a 1930s event, and it took a long time to recover, and we'll go back to seagrass in later slides. The bold sea urchin disease, that was a thing of the 1970s, and we just Bob Earl managed to find one picture of a sea urchin which has lost its spines. Believe it or not, that middle of the bottom line of pictures is actually a dead native oyster. It's a bit difficult to see. That was taken in the Yam, and a protozoan parasite. So we know some of the reasons for disease, but sometimes we don't really know why things have disappeared. And a question for you, because I want you to look out for this: are starfish next? Has it already happened? Starfish wasting disease, which has devastated Pacific coast starfish, has been detected in the Irish Sea in sunstars. And this is a sunstar here. Sunstars seem to have entirely disappeared from the English Channel coast of southwest England, simply because it's a cold water species, in my view. It was once described as the most common species at a particular location off Plymouth. We won't find it now. So do look out for that, and especially look out for other species of starfish, such as the seven-armed starfish, which I think have disappeared. And then the avian flu, I think that, again, there's the picture, and here are some records. Any lasting effects on seabirds? Alex Banks will have the answers to this, but you've got 400 gannets washing up or detected dead at sea. 5,000 mortalities estimated at grass home of gannets. But comparative counts between years suggest a 54% decline. So this is a major event. And I'll come back to this in relation to common seals and focine distemper virus. Is we've got experience now so that you can tell the concerned public, you can tell a government minister, okay, yeah, this is awful, this is dreadful, we might be able to do something about it, but if we can't, they're likely to recover, and that recovery is likely to be maybe 5 years. I'm looking at Alex Banks, maybe 5 years. And focine distemper virus, this was something which I'd just been employed by the Nature Conservancy Council, as was, in 1986. And then in 1988, along came this awful virus which killed so many seals, 18,000 harbour seals, 300 grey seals, deaths of 21,700 seals, estimated to be 51% of the population. People love seals, they love seals, and it caused an enormous amount of press coverage. And the Daily Mail, the Sun newspaper and so on, opened up funds that you can contribute to help to do something about this disease. Well, the mammal expert, the mammal specialist at the Nature Conservancy Council at the time, said, this isn't a nature conservation issue. They'll recover within about 5 years. It's an animal welfare issue, yes. So sometimes you may need to separate what is actually an animal welfare issue versus a nature conservation issue. But you can't be sure that recovery could be occurring. You can't be sure that the disease won't carry on. We all think of COVID and so on. But diseases don't necessarily last forever. And recovery and restoration. And I'm turning the pages of my crib sheet, which I haven't really been referring to. So look at this impressive slide. This is seagrass recovery, natural spread, new discovery and habitat restoration increases known southwest seagrass areas over the recent decade. And it's Plymouth Sound here, but it's also happened in some of the other estuaries and bays and so on in southwest England. And you can see the hatched areas, which are where seagrass has been found in the past. and then you can see the right-hand one where the seagrass is present now. I'm very curious about the seagrass bed inshore of the Mewstone at Wembury, because that was noted as being there in the early 1900s, and we went looking for it about a year ago, couldn't find any. It's very, very similar to places like Mounts Bay, St Michael's Mount, where there is a seagrass bed there, and the same with Hannaford Point, inshore of Looe Island, where there is seagrass inshore of the island. So it was doubtless a correct identification, but we can't find it now. So lots to look at. Ollie Thomas has worked on the intertidal seagrass, PhD thesis. Not sure if he's published anything yet. Anyone know if Ollie is actually going to publish anything? Because unfortunately he's gone and got a job.
Yeah, the first draft is almost here. So.
The first draft of a paper for publication?
Yeah, the remote sensing one's very low.
No, because that was absolutely fascinating, that locals were saying, you know, we're looking out the window and we can see a lot more seagrass than we used to. And we rely so much on people doing that. Yeah. And Bob is telling me to get a move on. Okay, understanding path system change, restoration. Lundy no-take zone, only 3.3 square kilometres, established by the Devon Sea Fisheries Committee in 2003. Yes, we expected great results from this. In fact, there's a measured approximately five-fold increase in numbers of commercial-sized lobsters between 2004 and 2022 in the no-take zone. But here's the but. Now, the no-take zone apparently had no impact on the attached seabed marine life. Why should it? The attached seabed marine life wasn't being exploited in the same way as the lobster population was being fished. So, you know, have a look there. But when you look at examples like New Zealand, where the exploited fish populations and crawfish populations were eating the sea urchins, which were grazing the seaweeds, and so once they could, when the exploitation stopped and the fish could grow bigger, the lobsters could grow bigger, the sea urchins were eaten, and all of a sudden you got a much richer community developing. Don't assume that that will happen in your particular instance. And then an important one, Lyme Bay, a classic story of recovery. You can see in the top right there some of the graphs of the range of species, taxa, not necessarily species, but taxa, present over the years. You know, some increase, messed up by the 2013-14 storms. That confused the monitoring work, but I think it remains an important lesson in recovery following the removal of mobile fishing gear. And seabird numbers, I see this at Lundy. On Lundy, Lundy was full of rats, and it was an enormous project to get rid of the rats, which involved trapping and poisoning and so on. And we've now got numbers of puffins which are heading towards what they were in the 1930s. Somehow the puffins were keeping their head above water, as it were, despite the rats. But now, without the rats, they're doing really, really well, as are other seabird species, such as guillemots and razorbills. Storm petrels are now breeding on Lundy, absent in rat years, and Manx shearwaters are doing well. So get rid of the predators, get rid of the pressure, and you should get recovery. Great whale recovery, question mark. A lot of data being collected, both by Cornwall Wildlife Trust Seaquest surveys, but also the people who run tripper boats, who take people out to see charismatic marine life. And they're very good at reporting, and they're very good at keeping records. And a lot of what we rely on, though, is also records from the general public, and all in all brought together. And of course, you see the headlines on the television and in the newspapers. We're getting a good increase, and it's shown in the histograms here of whales. Human impacts.
We can whiz through this because we've covered a lot of this already. Actually, I think isn't hindsight a beautiful thing? This amazing analysis done by Herne, Venn and Gaskell covers the period 1950 up to 2015 and stops there. Be quite nice to go back and do that analysis again. But what's really useful about this is it gives us a little bit longer a time series back. So this analysis kind of really looks at that industrial fishery in the Celtic Sea, not before it was managed, but while it wasn't managed very well. We still had USSR fleets in our waters for some of that. So what's really interesting in this time series, and it's very complicated, it's just really there for the pretty colours, to be honest. I'd only look at the top slide if I were you. Essentially, there has been a really large fishing-induced biomass decline, but it was mostly before 1970. So when we're thinking about these changes that we've seen since 2015, we need to keep in mind that we were already looking at a heavily changed ecosystem. And that's a really important thing to consider. We're never going to be able to go back there. I think environmental shifts mean that we are in a very different position, and recovery wouldn't look like what we had in the past. Some of those reductions in large demersal fish, so we've talked about them in more recent years in relation to temperature changes, changes in plankton, and a move away from demersal fish like gadoids and to kind of the apex predators like the blue sharks. But actually there had already been a move away from demersal fish from the 1950s. What's quite interesting is this paper actually talks about signs of recovery from 2010. So it might have been that the populations were just starting to come back in 2010, just as this ecosystem shift happened. So it's just a really neat way of kind of considering that longer term, and the idea that the ecosystem shifts we were probably more vulnerable to it because we had already altered the ecosystem to some extent. And then if those environmental shifts have happened, then that's kind of double whammy. I think also when we're looking at the benthic recovery as well, and also things like herring are benthic spawning, and there is very little protection for their spawning areas at the moment. So we have to take those kind of longer term impacts of trawling into account. So really interestingly, there was a petition to Parliament in the 14th century about people chucking stuff off the back of their sailboats and dragging them along the seafloor. But really, it was after 1820 that trawling really took off. Before then, it was more or less just the southwest that was regularly trawling. Because of railways, that opened up cities and large populations for transporting the fish. So the markets opened up. And that's why the trawl fisheries really took off. The official catch statistics started in the 1880s, but obviously we've got pretty big uncertainties in some of those longer time series. But we've only been studying the effects of bottom trawling for 40 years. So we have no idea what that kind of pre-trawling, pre-19th century benthic environment really looked like. I think we all know that they probably would have had more larger bodied epifauna before intensive bottom trawling, but I don't think we really know what the benthic environment looked like, and that includes the environment for small juvenile fish, for fish eggs, for those kind of benthic food chains that are also a really important part of this and linked to the pelagic communities, and that reduction in habitat complexity overall. I'm going to head over to Ruth to do justice to the bottlenose dolphin stuff. Is that okay? Yeah, sure. Brilliant.
Thanks, Livy. Okay, so the southwest bottlenose dolphin population, we've had bottlenose dolphins around the Cornish and the southwest coast for many, many years, but we saw a decline mainly through our citizen science networks, through the Sequest Southwest programme, since 1990s, and that raised a bit of a concern. And it's actually on the back of one of the Southwest Marine Ecosystems conferences where we were like, what's happening with this? You know, is there really a decline? We don't know exactly how many bottlenose dolphins we've got. Are they declining? Are we just not seeing them? Let's do a little bit more information gathering and assessment. So we set up the Southwest Bottlenose Dolphin Consortium in 2016 and did a whole series of photo ID pieces of work. And that's proven that we've got a resident pod of bottlenose dolphins that live around what we believe to be the southwest of about 48 animals, and they are very, very specific in terms of their social integration. They do not mix with any of the offshore pods, and they only stick within that 50-metre depth contour. But through that southwest consortium where we were sharing this data and identifying these animals, we could track individuals through their fin nicks and marks. So that picture on the top shows, it's a bit like a fingerprint for these animals. You can identify individual animals. They've all got numbers and names, so we can track where they've gone. And since sort of 2017, we've noticed this change in distribution, where they're not really focused around Cornwall and Devon as their primary areas. They are ranging right up to Sussex and possibly beyond. So we've got distinct evidence gaps. A lot of our data, particularly down here in the southwest and around Cornwall, was from a lot of the ecotourism providers who were out on boats and sending us and helping to analyse this data, particularly Duncan and Hannah at Marine Recovery down in Penzance. So we have got gaps in that data, but since 2017, we've really seen this distribution change moving right up that south coast. So it's now the South Coast Bottlenose Consortium. But crucially, we now know that we've got this pod of inshore, very small number of animals, but they are not really given any statutory protection at the moment. And this range, crucially, overlaps with some high areas of human activity. So there's a strong, concern around that, how that impact of disturbance can impact this very small and fairly vulnerable population. I'll leave it there. Oh, is the next one mine as well? All right. All right. Which way how are you clicking on?
Press the down button.
Press the down button. Nope. Oh, it has stopped.
Click back on the presentation.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, changed. Thanks. So yeah, onto cetacean strandings, and this is really about has management had any impact? So Cornwall Wildlife Trust Marine Strandings Network is a unique network of volunteers who go out and record all strandings on Cornish beaches, and we've been recording that through Cornwall Wildlife Trust since 1992. It was managed by the wonderful Stella Turk prior to that. And we do that under the licence of Cetacean Strandings Investigation Programme up with the Institute of Zoology. We learn a huge amount from these animals on the beach. It's pretty gory, but we learn all sorts about the health of these animals, the cause of death, and consequently that helps indicate a little bit about some of the other impacts happening to our marine ecosystems. We also send a number of animals for post-mortem, and we do what we call the bycatch evidence evaluation protocol for external injuries for those animals on the beaches as well. You can see from that graph that there are a significant number of animals, and this is just for Cornwall alone, so we get between 100 and 250 animals on a fairly regular basis washing off on Cornish beaches. Only about 5 to 10% from our drift modelling, we believe, of all those animals that die at sea actually wash ashore. So that 100 to 250 is potentially significantly more in terms of the actual numbers of animals that die. And from the post-mortem results and the beep results, we know that on average about 30% of all of those cetacean strandings, so harbour porpoise, dolphins and whales, but primarily harbour porpoise and common dolphins, those strandings are due to bycatch, which is accidental capture in fishing net. Now there was a significant peak you can see in the early 2000s, and that triggered a really big public campaign led by the Wildlife Trust, but several other NGOs got behind it as well. And the result of that was an EU regulation 812, which came in 2004. And that was really to put acoustic deterrent devices on some fishing vessels of certain sizes, fishing in certain areas for certain fisheries. And on the back of that, the UK banned pelagic pair trawling, which is trawling for particularly bass with huge nets between two vessels. So the UK banned that in UK waters, but only for UK fleets. So European vessels are still allowed to legally fish using that method in UK waters. There's another peak really you can't see it in the graph particularly, but there was a mass stranding event of 80 common dolphins in 2008, which washed up in very small creek in the Foul Estuary. We managed to refloat the majority of those, but 26 of those animals died, and that was down to, we believe, naval sonar activity out in the wider bay. So from these strandings, we're learning a huge amount. There's pollution, PCBs out there, there's bottlenose dolphin attacks, there's disease, there's all sorts. But there's not really any crucial action that's helping to minimise these. So the numbers of cetacean strandings has maintained at that level really high for the last 30 years since we've been managing it. Cornwall Wildlife Trust tried to find some mitigation through technology and technical measures and trialled some pingers, so these acoustic deterrent devices in 2013. So Abby and myself worked a lot with some fishers way back then, and those pingers were highly successful. They reduced the level of bycatch down to 82%, but sadly haven't been rolled out since those results in 2013, primarily down to political will and licence barriers not allowing the fishers to use these mitigation devices on their nets. So we continue to see these really high strandings. We've got some very bold words in our UK legislation. The Fisheries Act say we have to minimise and eliminate bycatch and work towards that. So those bold words are there, but we're really lacking action. We've got high-level strategies, but we really need to do more than just Clean Catch UK, which is a multi-million-pound CFAS-led and government-funded project, which has got a very fancy website and significantly less action on the ground.
You notice there's a little rise in 2015. So, to Pacific oysters, we're talking about human management here. There's an interesting story about this, which I won't elaborate on. So it's been elaborated by many other people. It was a deliberate introduction which was supported by MAF at the time, who simply ignored the expert advice which said Pacific oysters are going to breed in inshore waters. And lo and behold, in the southwest, they have. And we are still seeing, and we will continue to see, Pacific oysters spread. So, government can ignore science. In this case, ignoring the science has led to what we see on our seashores. So, coming to the sixth and final thing, and again, the take-home message here, I'm afraid, is I'm not constrained by any upcoming election, and those of you all seen the recent TV programme, but I know I and many other people who are involved with the water sector were extraordinarily disappointed by what has transpired, which in relation to the water industry. I mean, I put it gently here, but these are willful failures of governance, policy and management. Call it what you will, they are complete and total failures, mainly over the previous Conservative government. And secondly, and again this is the continuous message, as illustrated by one of the graphs that Rachel's provided, but we know about climate change. The problem of oil and gas wasn't what we thought it was going to be, it has changed. So let's do the sewage story first. I ran 100 conferences in the water sector and didn't run one, this is from 2003, 2014, not one on sewage pollution. I wonder why that was. But anyway, now, whether we like it or not, whether there are storms or not, and this is an English slide. It's not from the southwest, but the southwest version, you could just kind of divide it by 7 or 8 and you'll get to a very large number of spill events. These are spill events that occur whether there's storms or not. The big excuse was always, well, these are storms, but they're not. These are willful underinvestment by the industry. And this becomes problematic, or even more problematic, when we come to the point now where we are getting, and again, the East Coast is a very good example, and I'll describe the East Coast stuff from EastMe. in the Humber and in the Wash, the winter rainfall is actually causing massive changes in the actual extent of the freshwater influence in those estuaries in the winter. Huge impacts, and that's having the same effect in this country, in the southwest too. You've got a chap here who was actually on Gavin Tilson, whose office just around the corner, who's quoted just a week ago about the impacts in a southwest kind of setting. So we've got a combination of two things here going on. The rainfall rainfall events are really significant. Some of us also will remember that the most toxic pesticide ever released into the environment, certainly into the marine environment, tributyl tin, the whole issue came to a head in the mid-1980s. It's still being used. It caused endocrine disruption, real and very obvious endocrine disruption in a whole variety of species, including wiping out quite a lot of native oyster populations. On the Scilla, for those of you who dive in the Scilla, you can see TBT still working. It is an incredibly toxic chemical. A sort of molecule or two in a room this size still has an incredible effect. So everyone who talks about forever chemicals and all these kind of things, we've got a benchmark of something that was incredibly toxic. But let's come to oil and the oil and gas industry. And in effect, the oil and gas industry helped the marine conservation movement by having a number of very high-profile events, including the Torrey Canyon, which was truly a southwest event and got a lot of marine conservation initiatives off the ground quite by chance. This is the slide from John Moore, who many of you will know. And we begin to understand that the most impacted areas in relation to oil pollution are those sheltered areas, but there's recovery. The more exposed the sites are, the better recovery you get from oil pollution incidents. But in effect, our kind of mindset, the mindset of a whole generation was channeled by these rather large oil pollution incidents, and it drove lots of marine conservation initiatives. But that isn't the problem. That is seriously not the problem, as you will know. Now, Helen Findlay, who's based here, Professor Helen Findlay, kindly provided this slide about ocean acidification. It's a wonderful sort of series of time series. She makes the point about the kind of interannual variability of these measurement points, and you can see the graphs are, there's a spread of points, but the line is going in the same general, not helpful direction. Okay, you'll see that on the heat wave slide, for example, that we're moving up above the percentiles. And in the pH slide, you can, at the far bottom corner, you can see that this ocean acidification thing is taking place. So this is not at all, in any sense, helpful, and we need to be. It's a different type of change. It's slow, gradual, continuous, and it's caused by climate change. Then we get to plastics. I'll do the candid version of this. Plastics are the oil company's plan B. Okay? What you do is you take the oil out, you put it into plastics, it goes through a whole series of cycles, and then in the UK, we've got something like 50 incinerators, and now 25 new incinerators are on the blocks, and you basically put into plastics first, and then you incinerate it, so you get your carbon dioxide eventually coming up the incinerator slope. These graphs here, which Rachel's been kind to because in fact there are projections of this carrying on. Anyone who works in plastics has got a job for life. These curves carry on. They are depressingly reliable in their upward slope. Okay. Again, it's a product of the oil and gas industry and their deliberate policies. At least we've got a mechanism now controlling primary production, or primary production of plastics, which is on the cards. The health impacts of this are many and various, and I'll come on to this in a second or so, but the point is these health impacts are going to grow as time goes on. Microplastics, we're learning more and more about all the time. Plymouth is obviously a centre of our understanding of microplastics. I'm not going to elaborate this. Suffice it to say that if you go to Google and you type in images of the increase in microplastics, you can get a selection of curves which are all going up. Okay, and to come to the kind of the input from Penny Lindeek and Claire Ossel here from the MBA and from PML. The continuous plankton recorder has been recording microplastics now for a number of years, and the information is there in that time series. So this is a really powerful body of information that can be accessed, and obviously they started raising the issues about this, and they've been at the forefront of raising the issues of microplastics. The slide in the graph in the middle illustrates the fact that the size distribution of microplastics is, it obviously varies, and some that's big and small, and depending on which sort of size of net you use, you get more or less. But the reality is that those numbers are actually going up all the time. So I think the message I want to leave you from this pollution part of this is that the big issue is still climate change and what the oil and gas industry are doing in relation to that. And you all know that. And that's not going to go away, and it's a gradual change, and we've got to kind of perhaps do something about it probably rather quicker than we are at the moment. So, the end. Thank you to all my narrators. It wasn't quite sort of 60 minutes or whatever, but in any event, we've done that.